Well, hello there. We're back. For today's little discussion of literary theory, we're going to be covering two major subjects, both of them related to power dynamics and kind of interrelated depending on what your interest might be. You might have like a general interest in both of these, but maybe make a more specific, concerted effort towards one of them. Kind of depends on what you're into. So let me explain a little bit about these two theories and how they work. The first one that we're going to be talking about, I'm putting under the large term Marxism, but really, even a larger term might be more directly applicable here. What we're talking about when we're talking about Marxism, really the broader view, are economic readings of literature. The ways that you can look at literature as both a product of and a source of economic ideas. So, the first thing that I would say about this, and we're talking about literature, however you're defining it, whatever it might be. Literature does not occur in a vacuum. Literature is a product of the world. So when you think back to like what we were talking about when we were discussing New Historicism, one of the major things that we were saying with New Historicism is that it is an analysis of literature as a byproduct of its time, of the influences of that period, the historical moments of that period. When we're talking about economic theory, what we're talking about is something very similar, but we're taking even a sharper focus here. And what we're talking about, not just the historical events of the time period, but the economic conditions, monetary conditions, financial conditions, however you want to put it, of that time period. We might be talking about historical moments like, say, something that was written during the Great Depression. We could look at it that way. We might talk about how a work of literature might be more reflective of the economic conditions that it was written under. So if you look at, like, say, the 80s and the way that free market capitalism was this like dominating idea during the 1980s, a lot of things that are written during that time period are either bold statements of free market capitalism, and some of them are bitter indictments of that very same system. They react to it. The other way that we might want to look at economic theories are by looking at and examining the author him or herself. Authors are the creators, the originators of literature, and authors are not immune to the same conditions that we're talking about when we're talking about economic theories of literature. So that somebody who was writing during, like, say, the feudal system in Europe, right? Like things that we have from like the medieval period, right, are not going to look the same as things that were written by an aristocrat in the 1700s. These are people who were writing under completely different economic systems, people who have very different expressions of what money might mean. And another way to kind of consider it is like, think about it this way. If you have a lot of money, you tend to think about it one way. And if you don't have a lot of money, you tend to think about it a very different kind of way. So if we're looking at literature as an expression, as a statement of what people hold in their own mind about the things that go on in their lives, why would money be any different, right? Like literature would express their views of money, or their taking money for granted, or their view of looking at things as like troubled or flawed, or that whatever the view might be of money, economic systems, or anything like that, it all kind of falls under this large penumbra of it. The most famous kind of economic theory for reading literature, though, is Marxism. Now, I want to put this out here, okay? Whatever your personal views might be of the economy, of your own personal views politically, I'm not getting into that. Like that's not really what I'm trying to talk about here. What I'm talking about, what I'm explaining to you guys, is the prevailing view that informs this theory. So I'm not saying to you, like when I explain this to you, it's like you should all be Marxists. Let's all join the revolution. Like if you like that, that's your thing. But I'm just merely explaining it as a means to an end. Marxism is the view that all of history is a history of class struggle. And what Marx observed is that in the societies that he studied and that he looked at, very simply, just boiling this down to its barest essentials, he noticed that there are people who own the means of production. Okay, the things in society that make stuff or that generate wealth. There are some people who own it, and then there are people who work it. Okay, so think about it this way. I'll simplify. There is a guy who owns, say, um, there's a lord in a feudal system who owns a large tract of land. He owns it. It's been his family for generations. He is Lord Bluffington, right? Lord Bluffington owns this big tract of land because Lord Bluffington's father, the older Lord Bluffington, owned it before him, and you get the idea, right? They own it. They never have to work it though, because there are these other people, these serfs, who show up and they don't want to starve to death. So they're like, Lord Bluffington, we see that you have great wealth here. What can we do for you? And Lord Bluffington is like, you will work my fields and harvest my hay or whatever, right? What those people have done in Marxist terms is they have commodified their labor. Okay, they've sold their time and their effort in exchange for money, or in this case, a place to live and food. Marx observed, though, that this very same pattern holds throughout history, so that by the time you get to like the 19th century, there is a guy who owns a factory because his father owned the block and then built that factory, and then they inherited it, right? And they rent out various properties on the same tract of land. And in that factory, there are people who work in that factory because they have sold their time and they have sold their labor to the factory owner. In the 19th century, it was even further compounded because very often what these same people would do is work in a factory for this long, lengthy period of time, and they would be paid a wage, usually a very inadequate wage, by the factory owner, and then they would go to their apartment or their home where they rented the property, and lo and behold, the same person who rents them the property is also the same person who owns the factory. They buy their goods at a store that's also owned by the same factory owner. The whole thing is a closed system that preserves the wealth of it. You get the idea. So what Marx was saying is that literature made under this kind of a system tends to reinforce the purposes of the people who hold power in this system. Because if you think about it, say if we're talking about a book that's being published, right? That book being published is published by a publishing house. That publishing house is usually owned by somebody who has free capital that they can invest in having a publishing house. That publishing house doesn't publish just anything. That publishing house will publish things that make the people whose financial interests are served by the publishing house look good and further their purposes. So in a Marxist system, in a Marxist reading of literature, you can look at literature and see expressions of a dominant class, a powerful, moneyed class of people who self-perpetuate their ideas and try to keep these other views invisible. So when we're performing this kind of interpretation, what we're looking at is literature as a product of the economic and class situations that produced it. Okay, so if the author was, say, a rising middle class figure from like the late 19th century or the early 20th century, the literature that they would tend to create would have the ideas that are consistent, usually, with somebody born of that class. People who maybe have very radical ideas throughout the course of literary history tend to be not the small laboring grunts out there in like the fields or working in the factories. It tends to be people with a great deal of wealth and a great deal of liberty espousing these radical ideas because they are free to do so. The people who are working in the factories and people who are working in the fields don't have a lot of literature to their credit because they're too busy working to stay alive. So you see how like there's a system in place, and Marxism tends to comment on that system. Now, Marxist criticism tends to be just that, tends to be criticism, so that if you see things that are very conservative in their economic worldview or very capitalist in their sensibilities, Marxism tends to criticize those and find those to be inadequate. That again, going back, if we're just replacing Marxism with like the very broad view of economic theory, there are ways that you can do capitalist readings of things. whatever your economic ideas might be, you can apply them to a work of literature. In Marxist terms, worldview is the expression of the dominant class. So there is an inherent interest of that dominant class to perpetuate a worldview that is consistent with its own ideas. If I am a rich, powerful person, I tend to create literature or allow literature to be created that serves my interests. I would not allow something like, this radical book that Mr. Vona wrote. That's this bitter indictment of the way that the economy works and the people and the powers that be. It would be more in my interest to either make that seem fringe, crazy, quiet it down, or squelch it all together and try and blot it out. In Marxism, and just as in the next thing that we're going to talk about, post-colonialism, or like some of the other things that we've talked about before, like when we were talking about feminist or sexual political theories, one thing that is a prevailing concern is this idea of power. Okay, who has power and who is repressed? And very often in Marxist criticism, people who have money have agency and have freedom, and people who don't are repressed and quieted. If you're interested in this, if you're finding this to be something that you might want to write about, what you're going to do is focus on either the material conditions that are presented in the novel or in the play or in the work of literature, right? So you might look at, who has money in this work of literature? Who has it, and like when they have it, how do they act? Are they good characters that we're supposed to like and identify with? In which case, that would seem to suggest that money is not evil and having it is not wrong, and that the system that allowed people to have it is you see what I'm saying here? Like, it's not like having money is this terrible evil, or how did the people get it? One of the books that's on your book list, for example, is a book called Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Mansfield Park tends to be, in my opinion, one of the most underread of Jane Austen's works. And one of the things that's an interesting question in Mansfield Park is the aristocratic family around whom the story's events occur. There's sort of like a question about how they made their money. It's left kind of vague and ambiguous. Austen never expresses these things directly, but it's implied through innuendos and other things that they made their money off the slave trade, the British slave trade. Again, not something that's like, comes right out and expresses that. But if you play around those edges, you can find maybe some statements that Austen is making about how that money in that family is perhaps emblematic of a lack of character. You can make that argument. Great Expectations, a work by Charles Dickens that I also have on the list, deals with a young orphan who inherits this great wealth, and what that great wealth does to that person. It's something of a central question in the course of that book. Now, that's one thing that you can focus on when you're looking at economic theories. But another thing that you might want to look at, or that you might want to consider, are the material conditions of the author, him or herself. Dickens made his living by writing. So his view of the economy or of money might be very different than somebody's, like Lord Byron, who was an aristocrat, who was born into so much money that he never had to worry about work or money or anything like that. So when you're comparing these things, when you're weighing these different considerations, you're applying economic theory to work of literature, which is one thing that you might want to look at. So that's sort of like, in a nutshell, what we're considering when we're looking at economic theories and Marxism. And for some people, they love this stuff. This is like right up their alley, and they love talking about it. For other people, it's like, yawn, whatever, who cares? Up to you, though. One thing, though, that I think is kind of like a nice fit with Marxism, something that I like to present these together, is this other idea of what's called post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory is the study of the interactions of societies in a colonial system. So very often when we're in class, the way that I'll present post-colonial theory to you is I will give you a scenario involving space travel. Imagine for a moment that we were able to travel off via a wormhole to a far-off planet, and that we meet the inhabitants of this planet that's very much like Earth and happens to be filled with all kind of rich, minerals and exotic gems and whatever. And we meet the inhabitants who are shaped like little cubes, and they speak to us in their strange little language and everything. And as we're talking to them, we develop our own ideas about who they are and what their societies are like and how they're so much different than us and all of that. And the minute we realize the great wealth that's present on that planet, we, as this force that have come into it with a great deal of weaponry and technology and everything, find ways of separating the native inhabitants from their precious goods. When we talk about them in a certain kind of way. When we write about them in a certain kind of way. And what people have noticed over the course of time by analyzing literature from this very system, which should seem very familiar to you without any notice of space travel whatsoever, we're talking about a colonial system. And America was founded on a colonial system. India went through a colonial system. Like there are pretty much all over the world throughout the course of history. You have seen the influence of one society that had a great amount of money, power, wealth, technology, uh, weaponry, better, faster ships, the ability to travel more quickly, right? Interacting with these other societies that didn't have that stuff. And what tends to happen tends to follow a pattern. And that pattern tends to follow a colonial system. So when we're talking about colonial systems in literature, we are applying a post-colonial theory to it. We are looking at how literature is a reflection of empires. That is, the powerful society that went into the other society and interacted with it. And the interaction tends to be one that's exploitative in nature. So what their associations are like with their colonies and how they tend to be presented in the literature of its time period or after its time period, this is a central consideration of post-colonial theory. Just like Marxism, though, the reason that these fit together so well, I think, is that it focuses on power disparities. And the difference here is instead of just talking about those power disparities in terms of money or economy, in post-colonial theory, what we're really trying to do is talk about how they are connected to culture and cultural ideas. So there's a convenient tool that takes place over the course of a colonial interaction where the conquering force, the colonial power here, tends to talk about it, the native inhabitants, in certain kinds of ways that devalue them, dehumanize them, and make them appear strange and weird. And that depiction is not just something where it's just like, oh, we don't know what they are, and therefore we only talk about them this way. What a post-colonial theorist might argue is that portrayal follows a certain pattern because it does a certain kind of work. It allows people to conceptualize that other society in a way where they are able to then do things that they would not otherwise be morally allowed to do. So that by depicting, say, like the indigenous peoples of America as, like godless heathens who are not like us, good Christians coming over from Europe, uh, by depicting them that way, not only do they express a lack of understanding of what that society is, but it becomes an echo chamber where by doing that over and over again, it perpetuates the idea that these are not really people and that you don't really need to worry about their property rights or their goods or self-interest, and that you can just sort of roll right over on them. That's the work of the literature in a post-colonial theoristic view. Racial constructions, like what I just talked about, are a central concern of post-colonial theory. So somebody writing from the position of a colonial power, right, like the imperial force here, somebody writing, say, from the British Empire, might talk about another culture that they have dominated in ways that make them seem very strange and very other, very outside the normal box of what is expected in that powerful cultural force. Edward Said is a interesting person to read in this kind of theoretical mold. A really foundational figure, a really brilliant writer, and he studied depictions in British literature. I noticed that in British literature, because Britain was such a dominating imperial force all the way up into the mid 20th century, that the literature of the British Empire tends to follow these kinds of patterns that we're talking about. It's a depiction of a British culture, which is always taken as default, which is always taken as right, which is always taken as like, well, obviously, our culture is the best culture. Everything else is just, other, you know. Um, so what this does is it looks at these kinds of interactions by showing different cultures and different societies coming into conflict with one another and how that is depicted through literature. Lots of works on your reading list could be analyzed in this kind of a view. Lots of them. So if it's something that you're interested in, this is post-colonial theory, and this might be something that you might want to consider when you're formulating a thesis for your paper. Okay. I have one more theory I think that I'm going to go through with you guys, so I will post that for you, a little bit later. The last one that I want to talk about with you guys tends to be like a really like big one. We're going to be talking about structuralism and post-structuralism, and that tends to be a little hard for a lot of people, but also very interesting to a lot of people. So that'll be the last one that I'll post for you guys, and then again, I'm going to open it up for questions and anything that you guys want to know, you can ask. Okay. See ya. Bye bye.